Some people wear expensive suits to hide their loneliness. Others wear old coats to uncover the truth. On a gray October morning, when Manhattan seemed wrapped in a blanket of mist and silence, a man stepped onto the sidewalk wearing a faded brown jacket, worn leather boots, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Nobody looked twice. Nobody noticed the watch that had been replaced with a cheap plastic one. Nobody imagined that beneath the ordinary clothes stood William Harrison, the billionaire owner of Harrison Dining Group, a company whose restaurants stretched across the country and generated billions of dollars every year. He had spent decades building an empire around one simple promise: every guest deserves to feel welcome. Somewhere along the way, that promise had become another framed slogan hanging on polished office walls. Sales reports looked impressive. Customer satisfaction scores remained high. Investors applauded every quarterly meeting. Yet something had been bothering William for months. Letters from longtime customers had quietly stopped mentioning warmth and started talking about efficiency. Managers proudly discussed speed, margins, and labor costs, but almost never kindness. The numbers were thriving while the soul of the company seemed to be fading. So, without informing executives, district managers, or even his personal assistant, William decided to disappear into his own restaurant as someone nobody would remember. His destination was Harrison House, the flagship location overlooking Madison Avenue, where executives loved bringing clients because everything always appeared flawless. If there were cracks beneath the polished surface, he intended to find them himself. The morning air carried the smell of roasted coffee and fresh rain as he crossed the street, blending effortlessly into the flow of office workers. Through the restaurant's tall windows, he saw servers preparing silverware, hosts arranging reservation books, and managers inspecting every table with rehearsed precision. Everything looked perfect from the outside. It always did. As the front door opened, a cheerful bell echoed softly through the dining room. Several employees glanced toward him before quickly looking away. One young host forced a polite smile that disappeared almost instantly after noticing the worn jacket. Another employee whispered something to a coworker while pretending to organize menus. William noticed every expression without reacting. Years in business had taught him that people often revealed themselves long before they spoke. He requested a table for one. The host hesitated for barely a second before leading him toward the least desirable seat near the back, beside a service station where dishes clinked and conversations from the kitchen floated through swinging doors. William thanked him sincerely and quietly took his seat. Around him, conversations filled the room. Executives discussed mergers over espresso. A retired couple shared blueberry pancakes. Parents laughed as their little boy tried to stack creamers into a tiny tower. Life moved naturally, beautifully, exactly as a neighborhood restaurant should. William folded his hands on the table and waited. He wasn't testing recipes. He wasn't evaluating decor. He wasn't interested in profit margins. Today, he wanted to measure something that couldn't be entered into a spreadsheet: respect, compassion, character. Somewhere across the dining room, a waitress carrying a coffee pot paused for just a moment as her eyes met the quiet stranger sitting alone in the corner. Her name was Grace Bennett. She didn't know she had just become the most important person in the billionaire's day. Grace Bennett had learned years ago that the easiest way to recognize a person carrying invisible burdens was not by the clothes they wore, but by the way they looked around a room before anyone acknowledged them. Every morning she arrived 30 minutes before her shift, tied her dark blonde hair into a simple ponytail, straightened every coffee mug on the shelves, and quietly greeted the cooks, the dishwashers, the hosts, and the cleaning staff by name. Some mornings they answered with smiles. Some mornings they barely looked up. She greeted them anyway. Her mother had once told her that kindness was only genuine when it expected nothing in return, and those words had quietly shaped every day of Grace's life. She had earned a degree in hospitality management while working evening shifts, but instead of chasing luxury hotels or corporate offices, she chose to stay where conversations still mattered. She believed people rarely remembered the perfect meal. They remembered how someone made them feel while serving it. As she carried the fresh pot of Colombian coffee across the dining room, she noticed the man sitting alone in the corner. His jacket looked weathered from years of use. His boots carried tiny scratches that suggested long walks instead of expensive cars. Most guests checked their phones while waiting. He simply watched the room in complete silence, almost as though he were listening instead of looking. Grace noticed the empty water glass before anyone else did. She walked toward his table with an easy smile that looked completely natural, neither rehearsed nor exaggerated. "Good morning," she said warmly. "I hope you are staying dry out there. The rain surprised all of us today." William looked up with mild curiosity. Her voice carried no trace of pity. She sounded exactly the same as she had while greeting the business executives seated near the front windows. "It finally caught me," he answered with a small smile. "I lost that battle." Grace laughed softly. New York usually wins those battles. She poured fresh ice water before he could ask. "Take your time with the menu. There is no rush today." She placed the menu gently in front of him instead of sliding it across the table. It was a tiny gesture, almost invisible, but William noticed it immediately. Across the dining room, another server leaned toward the service station. "Table 26 has been sitting there for 5 minutes already," she whispered. "I hope he actually orders something." Another employee shrugged. "Probably just wants free refills." Grace heard every word while pretending not to. She simply returned to the table carrying a small basket of warm bread that guests normally received only after placing an order. "The kitchen baked these about 10 minutes ago," she said. "Please enjoy them while you decide." William looked at the basket. "I have not ordered anything yet." "You do not have to earn fresh bread," Grace replied with an easy smile. "You only have to be hungry." The answer lingered in the air long after she walked away. William watched as she crossed the dining room, stopping to help an elderly gentleman fold his walker beside the booth, without making him feel incapable. A few minutes later, she crouched beside a little girl who had accidentally dropped her crayons, gathering every color before the child's father even realized what had happened. She refilled coffee for another guest without interrupting an important conversation and thanked the dishwasher, carrying heavy trays, as though he were the most valuable employee in the building. None of those moments lasted more than a few seconds, yet together they revealed a pattern that could never be rehearsed. William had visited hundreds of restaurants throughout his career. He had watched countless employees perform polished versions of customer service whenever supervisors were nearby. This felt different. Grace behaved exactly the same whether someone noticed her or not. For the first time that morning, William wondered whether the answers he had been searching for were not hidden inside reports or executive meetings. Perhaps they had been quietly carrying a coffee pot all along. William reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and slowly unfolded the paper menu as though he had all the time in the world. In reality, every second was another quiet test. He deliberately skipped over the signature steaks and seafood that generated the restaurant's highest profits before looking up with an almost hesitant expression. "May I ask a question?" Grace appeared beside the table within moments, carrying nothing except genuine attention. "Of course," she replied. "What can I help you with?" William pointed toward the least expensive breakfast on the menu. "Would it be all right if I ordered this and stayed for a little while? I have somewhere to be later, but I could use a warm place until then." Grace smiled without the slightest pause. "You are welcome to stay as long as you need. Nobody should feel rushed over breakfast." William nodded appreciatively before adding another layer to his quiet experiment. "Could I have tap water instead of bottled water?" "Absolutely," Grace answered. "Fresh ice too?" "Yes, thank you. Coming right up." There was no disappointment in her voice, no subtle attempt to upsell, no carefully disguised frustration over a small check. She treated the modest order with exactly the same care she had shown the businessman who had just purchased a $90 ribeye. William watched her disappear into the kitchen while another server approached the service station with an amused smile. "You are spending more time with table 26 than he is going to spend," she whispered. "That breakfast barely covers the cost of the table." Grace simply continued pouring coffee into a clean mug before answering quietly. "Maybe today he needs breakfast more than we need the table." The other server shrugged. "You always see the best in people." Grace smiled gently. "Someone has to." William heard every word without lifting his eyes from the menu. He remained completely still, allowing the conversation to settle inside him. The restaurant had invested millions of dollars over the years developing service manuals, employee workshops, and hospitality seminars. Yet the sentence he had just overheard carried more wisdom than entire training programs. A few minutes later, Grace returned with his breakfast arranged carefully on a warm white plate. The eggs were neatly prepared, the toast lightly buttered, and the fresh fruit had clearly been selected instead of hurriedly scooped into a bowl. She placed everything in front of him with quiet care before noticing that one corner of his paper napkin had fallen onto the floor. Without drawing attention to it, she simply replaced it with a fresh one. "Is there anything else I can bring you?" she asked. William looked at the food before speaking. "Actually, I forgot something." Grace waited patiently. "I think I left my reading glasses at home." She glanced at the menu still resting beside his plate. "Would you like me to read today's specials to you?" William hesitated just enough to make the moment believable. "Would you mind?" "Not at all." She slowly described each special with calm clarity, never rushing, never sounding impatient. When she finished, William thanked her sincerely. "You have been very kind." Grace answered with the same gentle smile. Kindness usually comes back around when people need it most. Before William could respond, the floor manager, Daniel Collins, walked across the dining room holding a tablet filled with reservation updates. His polished shoes stopped beside Grace's table, but his eyes settled almost immediately on William's faded jacket. Daniel lowered his voice just enough to sound professional while still making sure Grace could hear him. "Grace, when your guest finishes, we need this table available. Lunch reservations start arriving in less than an hour." Grace nodded politely. "He has already ordered. I will make sure everything stays on schedule." Daniel gave William a brief, practiced smile before walking away. It lasted less than 2 seconds. The moment he turned the corner, the smile disappeared completely. William noticed. Grace noticed too. Neither of them said a word. Instead, Grace quietly refilled William's coffee without being asked. As the rich aroma drifted upward, William found himself realizing that people rarely remembered speeches about company values. They remembered moments exactly like this, when someone chose dignity over convenience without expecting anyone to notice. William let nearly 20 minutes pass after finishing his breakfast. His coffee cup remained only half empty, and the folded newspaper he had borrowed from the entrance sat untouched beside his plate. Around him, the rhythm of the restaurant slowly shifted. Morning customers drifted toward the exits while hosts began preparing for the lunch rush. Reservation cards appeared on neatly arranged tables. The sound of polished silverware blended with soft jazz playing overhead. Every movement seemed carefully choreographed. William quietly observed them all. He knew exactly when the busiest hour would begin because he had approved the operating schedule himself years earlier. What interested him now was not whether the staff followed procedures. He wanted to discover what happened when procedures collided with humanity. Daniel Collins stood near the host station studying the reservation screen with growing impatience. Every few moments his eyes wandered toward the quiet man still occupying the corner booth. Finally, he walked across the dining room, forcing another professional smile that looked slightly thinner than before. "Good morning, sir," Daniel said politely. "I hope everything has been satisfactory." William looked up with a grateful expression. "It has been wonderful." "Thank you." Daniel nodded. "I'm glad to hear that. We do have several reservations arriving shortly. If you have finished, we would certainly appreciate preparing the table for our next guests." Before William could answer, Grace approached carrying a fresh pot of coffee. She had noticed Daniel's body language long before reaching the table. Without interrupting either man, she quietly refilled William's cup and placed a clean coaster beneath it. "There you go," she said warmly. "Fresh coffee." Daniel lowered his voice. "Grace, may I speak with you for a moment?" They stepped only a few feet away, but William could still hear every word. "This table needs to turn over," Daniel whispered. "We cannot have someone sitting here indefinitely after ordering the least expensive breakfast on the menu." Grace answered calmly. "He has not caused any problems. He has been respectful to everyone." Daniel sighed. "That is not the point. We have premium reservations arriving." Grace looked briefly toward William before returning her attention to the manager. "There are still open tables near the windows. We are not full yet." Daniel folded his arms. "Hospitality is important, but business comes first." Grace remained completely composed. "I believe hospitality is the business." Daniel stared at her for a moment, clearly surprised by the quiet confidence in her voice. She had not challenged his authority. She had simply reminded him of something easy to forget. At that exact moment, an elderly couple entered through the front doors without a reservation. The hostess hesitated while checking the seating chart. Daniel immediately directed them toward a waiting area. Grace noticed the uncertainty on the woman's face, and walked over before anyone else could respond. "Good afternoon," she said with a welcoming smile. "If you do not mind sitting near the garden windows, I have a lovely table ready for you." The couple smiled with visible relief and gladly followed her. Daniel glanced toward the nearly empty dining room before realizing she had solved the situation without delaying any reservations at all. William watched everything unfold in complete silence. Grace had protected a stranger's dignity without embarrassing her manager. She had solved a business problem without creating conflict. Most impressive of all, she never acted as though she were proving a point. Her decisions flowed naturally from who she was. A few minutes later, she returned to William's table carrying a small plate with a warm blueberry muffin. "The kitchen baked an extra one," she said. "It would only go to waste otherwise. Would you like it?" William looked at the fresh pastry before meeting her eyes. "Are you certain?" Grace nodded. "Food should feed people, not trash bins." William accepted it with quiet gratitude. As Grace turned toward another table, Daniel remained standing near the service station, watching her with an expression that mixed frustration, confusion, and reluctant admiration. William slowly broke off a piece of the muffin and realized that the greatest leaders were not always the loudest voices in a room. Sometimes they were simply the people who refused to let another human being feel invisible, even when nobody seemed to be watching. The lunch crowd arrived in steady waves, filling the restaurant with quiet conversations, polished shoes crossing marble floors, and the comforting aroma of grilled sourdough, fresh herbs, and roasted coffee. William remained in the corner booth, now nearly invisible among the growing crowd. That had always been the strange gift of ordinary clothing. Wealth attracted attention. Simplicity often erased it. Grace continued moving through the dining room with the same calm rhythm she had shown all morning. She greeted every guest with equal warmth, whether they wore tailored business suits or faded denim jackets. She remembered children's names after hearing them only once. She noticed empty water glasses before anyone raised a hand. She thanked the kitchen staff every time an order reached her tray. The restaurant seemed to breathe more gently whenever she passed through it. William watched carefully, searching for even the smallest crack in her consistency. He found none. Then he decided it was time for one final test. As Grace approached with another fresh pot of coffee, William slowly reached into the inside pocket of his old jacket. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. He searched another pocket, then another. Finally, he looked up with quiet embarrassment. "I am so sorry," he said softly. "I think I left my wallet at home." Grace did not react with surprise or suspicion. She simply listened. "I thought it was in my jacket before I left this morning. I was certain of it." William shook his head gently, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "I can leave my driver's license if that helps. I can come back this afternoon and pay every cent." Grace smiled with complete sincerity. "Please do not worry about it." William blinked. "You do not even know me." "No," Grace answered gently. "But I know what honest people sound like when they are embarrassed." William lowered his eyes for a moment, allowing the silence to settle between them. "Still, the restaurant should not lose money because of my mistake." Grace looked toward the register for only a second before turning back. "Give me just a moment." She walked quietly to the service station where Daniel was reviewing receipts. William could not hear every word this time, but he saw Daniel immediately shake his head. Grace remained calm. She explained something with measured confidence. Daniel crossed his arms, glanced toward William's table, and shook his head again. Grace thanked him anyway before walking toward the point-of-sale terminal. She reached into the pocket of her apron, removed a small envelope, counted a few carefully folded bills, and placed them into the register herself. William's heartbeat slowed. He had expected several possible outcomes. He had expected someone to call security. He had expected suspicion. He had expected policies and procedures. He had not expected this. Grace returned carrying the receipt with the same peaceful expression she had worn all morning. She gently placed it on the table beside the empty coffee cup. "Everything has been taken care of," she said. William stared at the receipt before looking back at her. "What do you mean?" "It is already paid." He frowned. "By whom?" Grace smiled as though the answer required no explanation at all. "By someone who believes everybody deserves a second chance." William immediately reached for the receipt, hoping to find a clue, but there was nothing except the word paid printed neatly across the bottom. He looked back at Grace, genuinely puzzled. I cannot allow you to do that. She shook her head softly. You are not allowing me. I already decided. William searched her face, trying to understand why a waitress would quietly spend part of her own day's earnings on a complete stranger. Before he could speak again, Grace lifted the empty coffee pot and met his eyes with a smile that carried neither pity nor expectation. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said 3 simple words. You belong here. The world around William seemed to disappear. The conversations faded into silence. The clinking dishes became distant echoes. Those exact 3 words had once greeted him every evening when he returned home exhausted from his first struggling years in business. His late mother had repeated them so often that they became the invisible foundation beneath everything he had ever built. He had not heard anyone say them in almost 20 years. Yet somehow, in the middle of his own restaurant, spoken by a waitress who had never met him before, they found him again. William remained seated long after Grace walked away, his fingers resting lightly on the receipt that still bore the single word paid across the bottom. Around him, the restaurant continued exactly as before. Plates arrived at tables. Coffee steamed beneath warm lights. Laughter drifted from a family celebrating a birthday near the windows. Nobody noticed that the quiet man in the corner was struggling to steady his breathing. He had spent decades surrounded by polished speeches about leadership, expensive consultants explaining customer loyalty, and executives presenting colorful charts that promised stronger company culture. Yet none of those presentations had ever reached him the way 3 simple words had only moments ago. You belong here. They had carried him backward through time to a tiny apartment in Brooklyn where his mother used to wait beside the front window every evening. No matter how difficult the day had been, no matter how many business proposals had failed or how many banks had rejected his ideas, she would always smile the instant he walked through the door and quietly say those same words. She never praised his ambitions. She never cared about becoming wealthy. She simply wanted her son to know that his worth had never depended on success. William had built an empire in her memory, yet somewhere along the journey, he had unknowingly allowed numbers to replace people. Grace had reminded him of that truth without ever knowing his name. Instead of revealing himself immediately, William reached into the hidden pocket inside his jacket and carefully sent a brief message from the secure phone he always carried for emergencies. It contained only one sentence. Pull every security recording from Harrison House beginning at opening time today. Confidential. Within seconds, his chief of staff replied that the request was already in progress. William slipped the phone back into his pocket before anyone noticed. He was no longer searching for mistakes. He wanted proof that Grace treated everyone with the same quiet dignity. One meaningful moment could happen by chance. Character could not. Over the next hour, he watched carefully as she moved through the restaurant. A delivery driver arrived carrying heavy boxes, and before anyone asked, Grace held the front door open with one hand while clearing a safe path with the other. A young father struggled to calm a nervous little boy who had accidentally spilled orange juice across the table. Grace appeared with fresh napkins, smiled at the embarrassed child, and whispered, "Tables are much easier to clean than worried hearts." The boy laughed instantly, and the father released a breath he had clearly been holding. A businessman sitting near the entrance grew impatient because his sandwich took several extra minutes. Grace apologized sincerely even after discovering the delay had been caused by a temporary equipment problem in the kitchen. She never blamed anyone. She simply solved the problem and thanked the guest for his patience. Later, she noticed one of the newest servers looking overwhelmed during the lunch rush. Without making a show of it, Grace quietly carried 2 of the young woman's trays to nearby tables before returning to her own section. She asked for no recognition. The new server barely had time to whisper thank you before Grace was already helping another guest. William realized something extraordinary. Grace never searched for opportunities to appear generous. She simply noticed people who needed help before anyone else did. The difference was subtle, but it changed everything. Kindness performed for applause always paused to check who was watching. Grace never looked around. Her kindness flowed naturally because it had become part of who she was. Nearly 90 minutes after sending his message, William's phone vibrated softly once. Another reply had arrived. "We reviewed the camera footage from this morning. She behaves exactly the same with every guest and every employee. No exceptions." William slowly locked the screen without answering. The confirmation did not surprise him. Somehow he had already known. As he looked across the dining room, Grace was smiling at an elderly woman celebrating her anniversary with her husband, completely unaware that the quiet stranger she had welcomed without hesitation had just discovered the greatest leader inside his entire company was not sitting in the executive office. She was carrying a coffee pot. When the lunch rush finally began to slow, the restaurant settled into a gentler rhythm. Empty coffee cups replaced full entree plates. Conversations softened, and sunlight broke through the clouds outside, casting warm reflections across the polished hardwood floor. William remained where he was, no longer pretending to observe. Now he was simply learning. Grace stopped briefly at the service station to organize a stack of receipts before another waitress, Emily, walked beside her carrying 2 empty trays. "Grace," she asked quietly, "can I ask you something?" Grace smiled. "Of course." Emily lowered her voice. "That gentleman in the corner. You paid for his breakfast, did not you?" Grace nodded without hesitation. "Yes." Emily looked genuinely confused. "Why? You barely know him. That was almost your entire tip from the first hour." Grace placed the receipts into their holder before answering. "Money comes back. Regret is harder to live with." Emily frowned thoughtfully. But what if he was lying? Grace rested both hands lightly on the counter. Then he received 1 free breakfast. She paused for a moment before continuing. If he was telling the truth, he received something much more important than breakfast. Emily remained silent, waiting for her to finish. Grace glanced toward the dining room, where William quietly stirred the last of his coffee. People who are truly struggling usually spend more energy apologizing than asking for help. Emily followed her eyes. "You really believed him?" Grace smiled softly. "I believe that everyone deserves one moment where somebody chooses trust before judgment." William heard every word from across the room. There was no performance in Grace's voice because she believed nobody important was listening. Daniel certainly was not nearby. The executives were not watching. There was nothing to gain from explaining herself so honestly. Emily leaned closer with quiet curiosity. "And those 3 words you told him, I heard you say them, but I have never heard you say that to anyone else." "What?" Grace's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not sad, not nostalgic, simply thoughtful. She looked down for a brief moment before answering. "Actually, I say them more often than people realize." Emily tilted her head. "You do?" Grace nodded. "Only when someone looks like they have forgotten where they belong." Emily waited patiently. Grace folded a clean linen napkin while speaking, her hands moving almost automatically. "After my father passed away, my mother worked double shifts at a neighborhood diner outside Albany. Some evenings, she came home completely exhausted. But before she ever asked about homework or dinner or bills, she always looked at me and said, 'You belong here.'" Grace smiled faintly at the memory. She believed the world could make people question their value every single day. Home was supposed to remind them that their value never changed. Emily's eyes softened. "That is beautiful." Grace shrugged gently. "It stayed with me." She looked toward William again, completely unaware that he had not missed a single word. Sometimes guests come in carrying something heavier than luggage. You can see it in the way they sit alone or avoid looking at anyone. I cannot solve their problems, but maybe I can help them remember that they still matter. Emily slowly nodded. "I do not think I have ever looked at serving tables that way." Grace laughed quietly. "Neither did I when I first started." She picked up another coffee pot. "Eventually, I realized we are not really serving food. We are serving people who happen to be eating." William felt another unexpected wave of emotion settle over him. The mystery was gone now. There was no hidden connection between Grace and his family. She had never met his mother. She had not somehow discovered his past. The words that had shaken him so deeply belonged to her long before they reminded him of his own life. That realization somehow made them even more meaningful. Grace had inherited the same lesson from someone she loved, carried it quietly into adulthood, and shared it freely with complete strangers. She did not know that one simple family tradition was about to transform the future of an entire company. Edit the following Monday morning, every manager and department supervisor inside Harrison House received an unexpected message marked mandatory attendance. No explanation followed. By 9 o'clock, the private dining room on the 2nd floor had filled with neatly pressed suits, polished shoes, steaming coffee cups, and quiet speculation. Daniel Collins stood near the front reviewing possible reasons for the meeting. Some believed corporate planned to announce a renovation. Others expected a discussion about quarterly sales. Grace almost missed the meeting entirely because she assumed it had been scheduled only for management. She had already tied on her apron when Daniel informed her that every employee was required upstairs immediately. Confused but obedient, she joined the rest of the staff near the back of the room, still wearing her server's uniform while everyone else carried tablets and notebooks. Conversations filled the room until the doors opened. William Harrison walked inside wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, polished black shoes, and the same quiet expression he had worn the previous morning. The room fell silent almost instantly. Several employees straightened their posture. Daniel's face lost all color. Grace looked at the man walking toward the front of the room, then back toward the empty chair beside the entrance where the quiet stranger had sat the day before. Her eyes widened as recognition slowly replaced confusion. William placed a small folder on the conference table but made no effort to open it. Instead, he looked around the room with calm, thoughtful eyes before speaking. "Yesterday I spent the entire day inside this restaurant." A ripple of surprise moved across the employees. "Not as your owner," William continued. "Not as your chief executive officer. I came as someone you believed had no influence, no wealth, and no importance." Nobody interrupted him. "I wanted to discover whether our values still lived inside this building when nobody believed leadership was watching." Daniel lowered his eyes toward the floor. William pressed a button on the remote resting beside him. A large screen behind him came to life. Security footage appeared from the previous morning. There was the front entrance. There was the quiet man in the worn jacket asking for a table. The room watched as different employees glanced toward him before returning to their work. Another clip showed Grace greeting him with the exact same smile she had offered every other guest. Then came the conversation about the inexpensive breakfast. Another clip revealed Grace helping the elderly couple find a comfortable table. Then everyone watched in complete silence as she quietly removed money from her owe. The meeting ended without applause. Nobody seemed to know whether clapping would make the moment feel smaller than it deserved. Employees quietly returned to their stations carrying something far more lasting than surprise. They carried perspective. Grace stood alone for a moment in the now empty conference room, still holding the document William had placed in her hands. She had spent years believing that the smallest acts of kindness disappeared the moment they were finished. Now she understood that some of them continued traveling long after the people involved had forgotten them. As she stepped back onto the dining room floor, everything looked exactly the same. The polished tables reflected the afternoon sunlight. Fresh coffee filled the air. Guests laughed over sandwiches and salads. The bell above the entrance welcomed another family through the front door. Nothing about the restaurant had changed. Yet somehow everything had. Several co-workers who had rarely spoken to the dishwasher now greeted him by name. One server quietly helped another carry a heavy tray without being asked. Daniel paused beside the elderly couple waiting near the entrance and personally walked them to the most comfortable booth instead of directing someone else to do it. Nobody mentioned the meeting. Nobody needed to. William remained inside the restaurant for another hour, this time sitting openly at one of the front tables. Guests recognized him immediately, but he declined interviews, photographs, and business discussions. Instead, he simply watched. He noticed tiny differences that would never appear inside a financial report. Employees smiled more naturally. Conversations slowed just enough for people to feel heard. Even the atmosphere seemed lighter. Before leaving, William quietly approached Grace one final time. She had just finished helping a young mother carry a high chair across the dining room. "Miss Bennett," he said. Grace turned and smiled exactly as she had the day before, without adding anything extra, simply because she now knew who he was. William appreciated that more than she realized. "May I ask you one question?" She nodded. "Of course." William looked around the restaurant before speaking. "If you could change one thing about this company, what would it be?" Grace thought carefully instead of answering quickly. Finally, she smiled. "I would remind everyone that we are not in the restaurant business." William raised an eyebrow. "No." Grace gently shook her head. "Food brings people through the door. The way we treat them decides whether they ever come back. We are in the belonging business." William stood completely still. Boardrooms had spent years searching for the perfect mission statement. Marketing teams had invested millions of dollars trying to describe what separated Harrison Dining Group from every competitor. Grace had just expressed it in 7 simple words. We are in the belonging business. William smiled, not as a billionaire congratulating an employee, but as a son remembering the lesson his mother had quietly planted decades earlier. I think my mother would have liked you very much, he said softly. Grace smiled back without knowing how deeply those words mattered. She sounds like she raised a good man. William laughed quietly. She tried every day. They shook hands before William walked toward the front entrance. Just before opening the door, he turned around one last time. Grace was already helping another guest, completely focused on the present moment instead of celebrating her promotion. That, more than anything else, convinced him he had made the right decision. Months later, every Harrison restaurant across America welcomed new employees with a different kind of orientation. They still learned recipes, safety procedures, and service standards. But every training session now began with a simple story about a waitress who paid for a stranger's breakfast, trusted before judging, and reminded a lonely guest that he belonged. Managers eventually discovered something remarkable. Customer loyalty increased. Employee turnover declined. Positive letters filled corporate mailboxes once again. Yet William considered none of those achievements the greatest success. The greatest success was invisible. Somewhere, every single day, another guest quietly walked into one of his restaurants carrying worries nobody else could see. And somewhere nearby, another employee chose kindness before convenience. Buildings could be purchased. Menus could be redesigned. Profits could rise and fall. But dignity, once freely given, always found its way home. Sometimes the most valuable thing a person carries into the world is not wealth, influence, or power. Sometimes it is simply the ability to make another human being feel that they belong.